We will restart now with a presentation that is entitled The Macronutrient Mixed in Weight Loss, Advantage Higher Protein. The presentation will be given by Professor Stuart Phillips, who is a physiologist and exercise physiologist interested by nutrition. He is also an athlete, and you see that the title is presented like a sports verdict, Advantage Higher Protein. So without additional comment, I let him presenting his talk.
Well, thank you very much, Angelo, for that introduction. I'd like to also just give my thanks to BiProUSA and the organizing committee and the people who have invited me here today. So, as the title implies, it's a statement, Advantage Higher Protein. At McMaster University, we like to pride ourselves on delivering evidence-based answers, and so you're going to see some evidence-based medicine, which is why I think I'm deserving of putting the exclamation point there. There's a dirty little secret in weight loss. If any of you have ever watched the program The Biggest Loser, you will know that the winner of The Biggest Loser, which is somewhat ironic, is the person who loses the most weight. In my estimation, and based on body composition changes, it's also the person who loses the most muscle. In weight loss, people lose usually about 75% to 80% of their weight as stored energy or adipocytes. That's great because it's now recognized that adipose tissue is an endocrine organ. Produces cytokines that interfere with things like insulin signaling, so it's not just an inert storage. There's also bone loss in some cases, particularly if calcium intake is insufficient. But the dirty little secret is that 20 to 25, and depending on the rate of weight loss, that can go up or down, of the weight that we lose is skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is obviously a key tissue in mobility. It's highly valued by various groups of athletes and a variety of other populations. It's also at the heart of a current controversy in the area of geriatrics as to whether people who are older should even be advised to lose weight. Because if you're going to lose weight when you're beyond a certain age, then it's going to promote the loss of muscle mass as well. And so transiently, that accelerates what we refer to as sarcopenia. When you lose muscle mass, you lose strength. When you lose strength, you're at increased risk for disability. And older people have a much harder time gaining back muscle than do younger people. So why else would we care about skeletal muscle? Well, first of all, I think as a tissue, skeletal muscle has been underappreciated in its role in metabolic health and the role in chronic disease. There are a variety of other roles of skeletal muscle as a tissue. First of all, it's one of the single largest contributors outside of the liver to our resting metabolic rate, which for most of us is the largest single contributor to thermogenesis in a given day. It's not a particularly metabolic active tissue on a per gram basis, but you have a lot of it. It's also the largest site of postprandial glucose disposal. So as a sink for disposal of glucose, when you have less skeletal muscle, and particularly when it's less metabolically active, you're at a predisposition for development of type 2 diabetes. And finally, I think it's vastly underappreciated that skeletal muscle is a substantial site of lipid oxidation. So it's going to play a rather important role in controlling blood lipids and in regulating your risk, for example, for dyslipidemia. There's another sort of secret that's kept in the closet, but that we've talked about that happens with weight loss, and that's with periodic weight cycling, or this sort of yo-yo dieting, so-called. And over time, if you look at the change in body weight, you see this sort of effect. In fact, in people who are obese, if you look at things like the National Weight Control Registry, they will talk about a lifetime of trying to lose weight, and yet the overall trend is that their body weight and body fat has gone upwards and to the right. At the same time, during each cycle of weight loss, you'll notice that their skeletal muscle goes down. Because during a hypocaloric period, if you're losing a certain percentage of weight from muscle, there's a decline in this metabolically active tissue, and so there's a concomitant decline in resting metabolic rate. And I don't think I'm surprising anybody. I'm not going to pick on any patients, but these public figures have openly discussed their battles with with body weight and trying to lose it and then keep it off, lose it and then keep it off, and sometimes have gained weight back in excess of what they had before. So with this pattern of weight loss, it would seem to make more sense to try and lose weight in this situation that's comprised of what we refer to as a higher quality weight loss, the greatest possible weight that's lost in terms of a ratio of fat to lean tissue. And that's where it comes into dietary protein. There's a number of reasons why dietary protein as a macronutrient would be advantageous in a weight loss situation. And I'm going to give you sort of the laundry list right here. First of all, from a satiety standpoint, protein's the most satiating macronutrient. Again, the experimental evidence for this comes from a number of great labs around the world, but just to mention people like Harvey Anderson and Marguerite Westerterp, for example, have shown that the satiating effect of protein, and dependent on the size, obviously, of the dose of the protein consumed, is more satiating than an individual dose of carbohydrate or fat. At the same time, we've known for a number of years that the thermic effect that's associated with protein is higher than any other macronutrient. It's also not readily converted into triglycerides. Despite what you might have heard, if you look at the biochemical pathways to deconvolute and take off nitrogen and form a triglyceride from amino acids, there really is only one true lipogenic amino acid out of 20. So, as opposed to what you might have heard, the overconsumption, I put that in quotation marks, of protein does not lead to the gain of body fat. There's also another sort of hypothesis that's been put forward by a couple of gentlemen that I'll show you a little bit later in the talk here, is that protein leverages other macronutrients. In other words, humans engage in protein-seeking behavior. So if you put people on lower protein diets, they consume more foods in an attempt to increase their protein intake. Whether the opposite is true is still a bit debatable, but I'll show you some data on that. And finally, and I think most important from my perspective, is that protein stimulates anabolism in skeletal muscle. So what we've often been told to prescribe for weight loss is sort of anywhere from 10 to 20% of protein, 45 to 65% by carbs, and then 30 to 35% by fat. So you get a protein intake that generally approaches 12 to 18%. Higher protein intakes tend to be in this type of range right here. And on a per kilogram body weight basis, when you're on a reduced or hypocaloric protein diet, the protein intake here is generally at or very close to, or maybe even a little bit below, the protein RDA of 0.8 grams per kilo per day, whereas at these intakes for most individuals, it's at about 1.1, 1.2. So not excessively high, but nonetheless greater than the RDA. You can see here that these are the intakes that I talked about. And so we're not talking about wildly excessive protein intakes. They can be higher than that, and they have been in some studies. But importantly, what is the effect of these types of protein replacement, if you like, particularly at the expense of carbohydrate in randomized clinical trials? So this is where the evidence-based medicine comes in. This is an article authored by Tom Wycherley and a cast of some very well-established colleagues from Australia. And what they did was looked at high protein, low fat versus standard protein, low fat. So the fat is low in all of these models. And they looked at all of the randomized control trials. You can get the paper to look at the search terms. I won't belabor those. And they really came up with the answer that when we look at, these are some of the study characteristics, studies extended, they were classified whether they were less than or greater than 12 weeks. The total energy intake for the high protein and the standard protein diets was roughly equivalent. So if you do your quick math, I've put it in kilojoules for you, but somewhere around 1,500 calories per day. And the protein compositions were that the high protein had 31%, the standard protein 18% of their energy coming from protein, or a comparison between about 1.25 versus just below the RDA, okay, of about 0.72. That happens when you have a low caloric intake, and even if you consume 18% of your energy from protein, these are big people. And so you're dividing by a large denominator, and you're ending up slightly below the RDA, which some people see as a criticism, but to get you above the RDA, it would require consuming about an extra 3 to 4 grams of protein per day. So not really a big deal in my mind. This shows the pooled for less than 12 and greater than 12 weeks on total body weight. You can see that the mean difference, and it'll show you down the bottom, of favoring either standard protein or high protein is shaded towards favoring high protein. The combined mean loss was about 7 kilograms, taking all of these studies into consideration. At the same time, you can see the changes for fat mass in the same studies here, favoring high protein and a mean of about 5.4 kilos. And I think one of the important points is to show you that when we look at the changes in fat-free mass or lean mass, this time where it's shifted towards the right, in other words, a retention of lean mass, favors high protein. So there was a mean loss of about 1.5 kilos, but that was attenuated with higher protein. Now, what I can tell you, I'm not going to touch on today, we've done a series of studies where we've fed people higher protein intakes, and when you add exercise into the mix here, of just about any form, but particularly of resistance exercise, so an anabolic stimulus to hang on to protein, we've had situations where we can completely ablate the loss of muscle mass and have 100% of the weight that is lost be fat. At the same time, the other significant finding, and this is really a hallmark of whether people are even complying with a prescription for lower carbohydrate, you see an immediate drop in triglycerides. It's a quick lesson in biochemistry to remind people that de novo synthesis of triglycerides from carbohydrates is remarkably efficient. And so when you drop carbohydrates, particularly simple carbohydrates, you drop the level of circulating blood triglycerides within about a week. So we use this as almost a biomarker in our studies of whether people are following our dietary advice. And you can see here that the reduction in triglycerides favors a high-protein diet. There were no other differences, according to this meta-analysis, for LDL, HDL, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, or any other markers. I'll talk a little bit later about satiety. This is an interesting finding in that the decline in resting energy expenditure, which was on average about 797 kilojoules per day, was attenuated on a higher protein diet, which probably matches up quite nicely with the sparing of fat-free mass or lean tissue. So higher dietary protein during weight loss in this meta-analysis was associated with, first of all, a greater weight loss. It was about 1 kilo, so not overly substantial. A greater fat loss, about 1.4 kilos, and so you have to do the quick math here. Obviously, you're losing more fat than you're losing weight, so you must be retaining something, and so you get a greater relative preservation of lean tissue. At the same time, there was a greater, this is what we call high-quality weight loss. So the ratio of fat, in this case, to lean lost was improved or shifted with a higher versus a standard protein diet. We saw a greater lowering of triglycerides by about 0.25 millimolar. That might not be a big deal clinically, but over time, it could be substantial. And there was a 596 kilojoule, or if you work it out, just over 100 calorie per day preservation of resting energy expenditure, which, if it were extended, would result in an extra about 0.5 kilogram of fat loss per month. Now, obviously, people can't continually sort of readjust their energy intake, and at some point it has to become their new stable energy intake. But from an energetic perspective, I think that that's a particularly poignant finding. Satiety is a difficult construct to study. I think it would be fair to say that if you got 3 of the leading experts or 4 of the leading experts in this room as to how best to measure satiety, they might all disagree. That's a problem when it comes to the food industry, because when you're trying to say satiety and satiation, et cetera, how best to measure it, the long-term outcome surely has to be that somebody might be able to stick to their diet a little better. But in the short term, there are a variety of ways of measuring it, but it's very difficult. So there were 5 studies that measure satiety or appetite. The inconsistent methodologies in this case precluded meta-analysis, and the greater satiety was reported, however, in studies with high protein in 3 of them. So you can take from that what you will. So we've talked sort of as a grab back about the first 3 points, and I just want to talk briefly about leveraging other macronutrients. Well, there are other lines of evidence. I don't want to pretend and get up here and say, you know what, I'm just choosing one meta-analysis. You can look at this paper. This is in patients with type 2 diabetes. This is an earlier meta-regression done by Jim Krieger, and the message is essentially the same. So it's not a mixed message here. It's a very consistent message. The protein leverage hypothesis is something put forward by Steve Simpson and Dave Rabenheimer. And it basically goes as this, is that humans and animals have a fundamental appetite to eat relatively stable or a set amount of protein. And so if you looked at an individual on a balanced diet, and this was their target daily energy intake, this is the amount of carbohydrate and fat they would consume. This is the amount of, in terms of kilojoules, of protein that they would consume. If you put them on a lower protein diet, then to get the same amount of protein, they would consume a greater amount of energy. And sort of similarly, but leveraging it in the opposite direction, if you put the same people on a higher protein diet, then the theory goes is that they should consume less fat and carbohydrate and a little bit of extra protein, albeit, but yet calorically they push themselves into a situation where they're consuming less energy. There's been lots of good studies done with this protein leverage hypothesis in animals, and there's been very few done in humans, but I'll just highlight one of them. This is a paper by Gosby. It appeared in PLOS One in 2011. What I'm showing you on the left here I think is particularly important because these were the meals that were fed at graded protein intakes from 10 to 15 to 25%, and these were in lean humans, not obese or overweight, in a crossover study, and they were fed these meals for a 4-day period, and the investigators looked at how much energy they consumed. Now, the important part is these meals are virtually indistinguishable. So the protein was covertly hid inside the food itself. And when you looked at the energy consumption in this period, you can see that it was greater across the 4 days with the low protein versus the sort of moderate or 15%, but we didn't see the leverage in the opposite direction. So in an ad libitum situation, albeit only 4 days in duration, there was no sort of spontaneous suppression of food intake at a higher protein intake. So I think these studies are interesting. We can see that if you go to lower protein intakes, you get the effect, but the leverage in the opposite direction has yet to be captured in humans. But it's an interesting hypothesis nonetheless. So finally, what I want to finish off my talk, it was with the stimulation of anabolism in skeletal muscle tissue. And for this, I just need to give you a really quick crash course in how muscle mass is regulated. So there are 2 opposing processes in muscle. One is protein synthesis, the other is protein degradation or breakdown. And they're ongoing and simultaneous. They're happening at the same time. So we call that sort of, if you like, futile cycle, muscle protein turnover. If you take somebody in an overnight fasted situation and you feed them breakfast, as you all had this morning, and the breakfast contains protein, then we get a large stimulation of MPS, or muscle protein synthesis. We get at the same time a concomitant suppression of muscle protein breakdown. Now we've got this green area in which we're gaining a small amount of muscle. It's imperceptible. You can't obviously measure this on a scale. We can measure it with isotopic methodologies. But then people don't eat for a period of time, probably just like you did before you went up for a little snack upstairs. But for most people, it's usually until about lunchtime. So there's a period in which synthesis declines, breakdown predominates, and we're actually breaking down muscle tissue. And then we're ebbing and flowing backwards and forwards through these states throughout the day. So that might be breakfast, lunch, and a dinner time meal. At the same time, you need to appreciate that this is an easy way for me to draw in PowerPoint because it can do sine curves, okay? And people are consuming an equal amount of protein, which really doesn't happen in real life, at equally spaced temporal periods throughout the day. So this is a stylized figure. But you can see that the net gain is going to be balanced in the end, by the end of the day, by a net loss. The situation's a little different if somebody performs exercise, particularly resistive exercise, in that all of these fed state periods are greater. You get an anabolic enhancement of the process of muscle protein synthesis. And at the same time, you get a little bit less net loss of muscle protein in the fasted state. Over time, you get either an increase in muscle size, that's hypertrophy, or you get an attenuation of muscle loss. So that's the sort of anti-atrophic or anti-sarcopenic, if you want to call it, effect of resistance exercise. So with that in mind, and this just sort of the main message, is that variations in protein synthesis are what affect muscle mass, and they're affected by both protein ingestion and loading. Is the protein source important? Well, we conducted a study a number of years ago in which we had young men perform a really intense bout of resistance exercise, and we fed them a cup of either skimmed milk, 500 mils of skimmed milk, so about 18 grams of protein, versus the same amount of nitrogen in the form of soy. So this was a soy beverage designed to actually mimic skim milk by composition. So same energy, same amount of protein, and yet the muscle protein synthetic rate after exercise was stimulated to a greater degree with milk. Now, the important point is that this is in only 3 hours of recovery, so it's an acute finding. And really what we'd like to know is whether this works in the long term. So we went ahead and did a 12-week training study, 5 days a week in young individuals, and we fed them either milk, that same soy drink, or a control drink, which was just sugar and water, but the same amount of energy, for 12 weeks, and they consumed these doses of protein immediately post-exercise, and then again 2 hours later. What we saw is that everybody, as indicated by the stars, gained muscle, but the milk drinkers gained a little bit more. And so proof of principle that the acute findings do translate into long-term phenotypic outcomes. So what is it in milk that makes it so effective? Well, we know that when you break milk proteins down in bovine milk, we get about 80% coming from casein, 20% coming from whey. Just to remind you that when you look at the amino acid composition, the essential amino acid composition of these three proteins, we have casein, whey, soy here. And what I've drawn for you here is their composition relative to the essential amino acid content of all human body proteins. So it's as if you'd thrown someone in a blender and then done an analysis on them. So anything above the line represents where these proteins have more essential amino acids than does human body tissue. Anything below the line is where these proteins have less. So importantly, you can see that whey protein is slightly higher in all of these situations as opposed to soy protein, and casein in most situations as well. I'd like to draw your attention to leucine, and the main reason is because leucine is what we refer to as not just a substrate, but a trigger amino acid. It kickstarts, if you like, turns on the light switch for muscle anabolism to take place. So this is a figure in which I'm showing you the blood leucine profile in young men after performing resistance exercise, having consumed whey, casein, or soy. And you can see the effects that I'm talking about here. Rapidly digested high leucine containing whey, slowly digested lower leucine casein, and soy is somewhere in the middle. And interestingly enough, in a rested or an exercise situation, we saw the greatest stimulation of muscle protein fractional synthetic rate with the consumption of whey protein. More superior to soy, but soy was also a little bit better than casein because of the slow digestion rate of this protein. So whey protein is more effective than soy or casein to promote anabolism following exercise or in the fed state. So we've come up with a hypothesis. It's not exclusively ours, but some other group have led us to think this is true, in which high leucine would be, or high leucine containing protein would be more beneficial to stimulate anabolism in skeletal muscle. And this leucine trigger concept is shown in this figure right here. And what it really says is you have to hit this trigger threshold, probably in intracellular leucine, to stimulate a rise of muscle protein synthesis. You can sensitize people, albeit transiently, by having them perform exercise, or you can make people insensitive by having them do nothing or be sedentary or put a cast on their leg, for example, or make them older, or give them diabetes or something like that, and in which case higher protein intakes will be necessary to stimulate this process. So I want to then close by showing you some really hot off the press data from a short-term weight loss study in which we've compared subjects who consumed either whey or soy. So for a 14-day period, they took 2 supplements per day, which provided about 27 grams of protein in each supplement. We controlled their diet running into the study, and we controlled their diet for the entire 2-week period. So bear in mind this is 2 weeks. And then at the beginning and the end of the trial here, we performed an infusion using our stable isotopic methods to look at protein synthesis. I don't really like to show tables, but I'm going to show them here to show you that the whey and soy groups didn't differ in terms of their total body mass loss. There was a little bit of a difference, albeit not statistically, in lean body mass and fat mass loss and trunk fat loss compared between the two. But remember, this is just a 2-week period. Importantly, the stimulation of muscle protein fractional synthetic rate here was always greater, whether it was before or after the weight loss with the consumption of whey versus soy. If you look at the meal-induced rises, you can see that the whey is providing a greater stimulation as opposed to the soy in terms of supporting muscle protein synthesis, and perhaps that's why we saw, albeit not significant, a greater retention of lean mass with the whey group. So protein quality also appears to affect the pattern of weight loss, and that's probably, we think, because of the leucine content of the protein. So in summary then, skeletal muscle is a tissue I think worth preserving in weight loss. It's particularly important for health. Higher protein diets offer some advantages compared to lower protein, particularly because of their favorable profile and body composition. The mechanism for protein's effects are multiple. Satiety, thermic effect. We don't really sure that we can pin it down on one of those. And protein quality, probably due to the leucine content, may help in the preservation of muscle mass during weight loss. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips, for this clear and interesting presentation. We have time for 1 or 2 questions,
Sure.
please.
Thank you. This is very interesting, but I was wondering, because the best biomarker for insulin resistance will be BCA, brain-chain amino acid accumulation in plasma. So I'm wondering if maybe leucine is good for muscle mass, but in the long term, could it be detrimental for insulin resistance?
So what you said was the BCAAs are markers for insulin resistance. So
Yeah.
I don't think that elevating the BCAAs or elevating the branch chains is causing insulin resistance. If you talk to Chris Newgard, who's the person who came up with that hypothesis, it's definitely a marker. And if you look at the articles he's written, what it does is it probably predicts a biochemical block that is preceding insulin resistance, which is why they're such a good biomarker. But there's no evidence to show that they're causative in insulin resistance.
But it could activate like a mTOR pathway.
Yeah,
and
that's
then block
the
insulin
theory,
resistance.
but if you talk again to Chris, that's not what he's saying in there. If you read his papers, I think it's pretty clear that he agrees that they're a biomarker, but not a causative factor.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you for a really elegant presentation. I'm Neeta Faruhi from Cambridge, UK.
Thank you.
I had a question about the quality of the protein more generally, beyond your comments about milk protein and the casein and whey. So in terms of meat and dairy and other types of sources, or even animal and plant origin protein. Would you have some comment on that, please?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to tease out some of these effects of protein quality the longer a study goes, unless you're going to put people on exclusively animal or exclusively vegetable protein diets. I don't think there's any question that vegetarian or vegetable or plant-based diets have very favorable effects in terms of blood lipids, blood glucose control, but the protein story is the same. And in fact, David Jenkins at the University of Toronto has a what does he call it, an Eco-Atkins diet, which is an Atkinsonian type profile in terms of fats and protein, and yet they come from plant sources. And he sees amazing effects of that style of diet. But I still think that the protein is having something, that there is a special advantage to that. I think a lot of it has to do with preservation of muscle. I think a lot of it also has to do with satiety. When you talk to people just anecdotally on high protein diets, they just don't talk about being as hungry or thinking as much about food.
Thank you.
Hi, Stephanie Anne Gerard here from L'Allemand Health Solutions. A very interesting talk. Thank you very much. I just had a question in terms of your high protein diets, and have you looked at changes in the microbiota from your participants, baseline and after the high protein diet? And maybe, I don't know if you can comment, I was just at a probiotics conference yesterday in Boston, and there's actually a thought that certain protein or amino acid, for example, carnitine, can actually be metabolized by the gut microbiota and produce trimethylamines or TMAO, and that is actually a risk factor for cardiovascular diseases.
Right.
So if you could comment.
So in answer to your first question, McMaster University, the hospital there is a children's hospital and a gastrointestinal center. So I have about 5 gastroenterologists chirping in my ear all the time that we need to collect feces. I tell them that my grad students aren't quite ready to do that, but at some point I'm sure we will. To your last part about the metabolism of carnitine, so the carnitine really comes with, the association is with red meat, not with the proteins per se that we're talking about here, but if there's a high consumption of red meat, there have been articles that have linked the production of TMAO, for example, to a variety of things to do with heart disease. And it's somewhat like the question from the first person who got up and asked. There's an association, but if you sat through Fred Brune's talk this morning, I think that there's no causal link yet at this point between the two. And it's really a red meat issue. It's not a protein issue per se.
Last quick question and quick answer.
Hi, thank you very much for the good presentation.
Thank you.
On a different perspective, I'm just wondering, what is your opinion on the fact that Health Canada is actually consulting right now and adding a percent DV for protein intake on the nutritional panels? What would be your intake on that, and what should be the recommendation?
Well, I've been doing this for a long time, and for the longest time I actually would write letters to people who publish textbooks talking about how if you exceeded a certain level of protein, first of all your bones were going to dissolve and then your kidneys were going to fail, and which are 2 of the most ridiculous hypotheses you've ever heard, and they're just non-existent. So I think the consultation and the putting a percent of DV on there, I think it's misguided, because I don't think the RDA is the right target to aim at. It's the minimal amount of protein to offset a deficiency. And that's really all I can say on that, because if I say it another time, I'm going to go crazy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stu. I have a gift for you for your muscle exercise. So it is a vape. So
Thank you. Yeah, they're very good. Thank you.